Today's presentation will be given by Yuan-Kang Wang, Associate Professor of Sociology, Western Michigan University. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and was an International Security Fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies. His work examines the nexus between international relations theory and historical China, and he is the author of a book, Harmony and War, Confucian Culture and Chinese Power Politics, published in 2011 by Columbia University Press. He has also published articles on peripheral nationalism in China, nationalist mobilization during Taiwan's democratization, and U.S.'s extended deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. His current research examines the issue of hegemony management by comparing the two hegemonies of Qing China and the United States. Today he will be speaking on international relations and Chinese history, the rise of the Qing. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming here, and thank the Center for Chinese Studies for the invitation. And what I'm going to do today is to use a theory of international relations to study Chinese history. And that is, we've been talking about the rise of China, but it's mostly in a contemporary sense. But historically speaking, the polity that we know today as China has risen a few times. The Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, and then more recently the Qing Dynasty. So what I'm trying to do is to use the perspective of international relations and to look at Chinese history and to see that whether the theory can be used to explain what happened in China and then use it as a guide to China's future behavior. So I'd like to start with a map of the PRC and the Qing Empire. As you can see, the current territorial boundary of the People's Republic of China basically overlaps with much of the boundaries of the Qing Dynasty. And although the Qing Dynasty is much larger than before, but before the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese heartland was not that big. It was mostly in this region, right? And so the question is, how did China become so big? And because it wasn't like that throughout history, right? Most of the time, the Chinese heartland is here, but its territorial boundary has expanded, almost doubled, right? And so what I'm trying to do is to look at how is it that they were able to accomplish this, and also how is it that they were able to maintain their dominance in Asia for so long. The Qing Dynasty lasted over 200 years, and in terms of its hegemony, it has about 167 years. So how was it able to remain on top for such a long time? And so why did I pick the Qing Empire? It's because in terms of the idea of regional hegemony, it was the very last one in Asia. And throughout other parts of the world, there are not many regional hegemons in history, and they are different from empires, because empires does not necessarily have to be a regional hegemon. But a regional hegemon is the most powerful state, the only great power in the system. And in Asian history, the Qing Empire was the very last one. And historians have talking about how the Qing Dynasty was the most successful dynasty of conquest. He Bingdi or Bingdi Ho talks about that. And it is also a foundation for China's present territorial boundaries. So that's the first thing. And the second is sort of from the field of international relations. That is that the field of IR, international relations, has its origins in the West, most European history. So we talk about balance of power, realism, liberalism, constructivism. Most of the theory has its roots in the West. And so, but I would like to expand the empirical domain of the field into Asia, because it's a much neglected area in the field. And by doing so, we can have more cases, increase the universal cases, and we can also increase the generalizability of theories. That is, if the theory can explain Europe and also Asia, that means that that theory will have more explanatory power. And so this is how Qing China rose in history. So at first, they originated from this area in Manchuria, in China's northeast today. And they were initially there were just a few tribal areas, and then there's a leader emerged, and then unified, conquered all the different tribes, and built a state in Manchuria, and then they expanded south, conquered Ming China. So this is territorial boundaries of Ming China. And then when they conquered Ming China, they consolidated the country, and gradually, and there was a huge civil war that happened, which I'll talk about shortly. And then the country expanded west to conquer Outer Mongolia and modern Xinjiang. And it became the largest and the most powerful state in the world at that time, around the year 1750 to 1793. China was the most populous and the most wealthy and also the most powerful state in the world. And so what I'm going to do is to look at the process of the rising of the Qing dynasty. And so the central questions that I ask is twofold. First is that how does a state become a hegemon in this region of the world? So, and the second part is that what strategy does the hegemon use in order to maintain its supremacy and to minimize resistance by weaker or lesser states? So the first question is, how does it rise to the top? And the second is, once it gets to the top, how does it keep it that way? And so those are the two questions that I'm looking at today. And so before I go to the case here, first just a quick definition here. The word hegemon I use here is value-free. If you know Chinese, it's a bad word in Chinese. But I don't have none of that. I simply use the materialist definition of hegemony. That is that there must be a preponderance of military and economic capabilities. And which is another way of saying it is the only great power in the system. And that's what I mean by the word hegemon. So there's no value judgment attached to the term. And so my argument is pretty straightforward. That is that for the hegemon, because once you are in the top position and you are very secure because you are the most powerful country in the system, and you would like to keep it that way. And so the objective is very simple. You like to maintain the distribution of power that is in your favor, and which is another way of saying that you like to keep your preponderance of power over others. And you can use the United States as an example, right? The United States would still like to keep the current balance of power in its favor. And if you ask anyone in the US, would you like to be number 2? Probably nobody would say that, right? We like to stay as the number 1 power. And it's the same thing for other hegemons in the past. So that's their strategic objective. And in terms of behavior expectations, I expect to see two things. First is the hegemon will expand its political interests abroad, and secondly, it will establish rules of the game that is about the governance of the international system. And those rules will help minimize resistance by the lesser powers. So let me go to them briefly here. So first, on the pursuit of power, the reason that I start with this is that in the field of international relations since the end of World War II, people have been talking about balance of power. Why is it that other states have not balanced against the United States, the current hegemon? But that kind of story is important, but it forgets the other part of the story, that is that, well, the hegemon has its method to keep it on top. It has its own method, strategy to pursue power. So there's a sort of a dynamic between the two. First is domination, the other is resistance. And so literature has been focusing on the resistance part and forgetting about the domination part. And that's why I start with the pursuit of power. And this is a sort of if you're familiar with the field of international relations, this is a realist framework and based on the idea that the international system is anarchic. That is that there's no central authority above states. And so in that setup, states cannot be certain about the intentions of other states. And so the best way to be secure is to be as powerful as you can and to accumulate as much power as possible. And so rising states will tend to expand their political interests abroad. And so once it gets to the top, it will try to maintain a balance of power that is in its favor. And if there's any potential rivals, it will try to weaken the rival or defeat the rival. And so in terms of domination, I look at these two strategies. First is the strategy of conquest, and it has two components. You can do divide and rule or divide and conquer. And in Chinese, there's a word 以治, using barbarians against barbarians. So it's basically the same idea there. And the Qing dynasty actually did some of them with the Mongols, which I'll get to shortly. And second is the wedge strategy. That is, well, the hegemon can try to drive a wedge between potential rivals. That is, to prevent the formation of a balancing coalition against the state. And so by doing so, it can weaken resistance to its dominance. And second part is about governance of the international system. We know that the current international system has its own rules of the game, right? Free trade, and then there are a bunch of international regimes and institutions out there. And the same thing in Asia as well. There's the tribute system in Asia before. And so it's kind of the rules of the game that govern the interactions between different states. And those kind of rules, it has its foundation in power. That is, they are shaped by material power, and so power can be used to create and also enforce the rules of the game. And historically in China, when China was weakened, the tribute system also tends to be weakened and eventually collapsed. And that's what happened in modern China to the last Qing dynasty. When Westerners came to China, they eventually overpowered the Chinese and were able to enforce the Westphalian system in East Asia. And also there will be an ideology that justifies the hegemon's dominance. And this project is a comparison between the US and China. And so the next stage is to look at the US. But I have a few quotes from the American case, sort of talking about how an ideology was used. And for instance, the White House in the Bush administration, they have a national security document. And in there, they talk about how the US would like to maintain a balance of power in Asia, and that favors freedom. So once you have a balance of power in Asia, and that's good for freedom. So you have a strategic objective there that is preventing the rise of a regional hegemon in Asia. The other is it is good for freedom. And so nicely combined together. And Sam Huntington, the late Sam Huntington also talks about how US hegemony is good for everyone because the United States can provide the public good of stability and peace. So next I'll look at the rise of the Manchu state. And I break it into 4 parts. First is state building process, and that is that when they were a very small unit in Manchuria, and then they gradually became a state there. And once they became a state, they went into a conquest phase. So they fought Ming China, and eventually they were able to prevail. And once they prevailed, there were a lot of domestic problems, still resistance to Manchu rule, and also there's a resistance regime on Taiwan that needs to be dealt with. So the country went through a consolidation phase. And so once after Taiwan was conquered in 1683, the Qing dynasty was the regional hegemon in East Asia, and it started a very massive program of westward expansion. And so you can find parallel in the history of the United States as well, right? This country started off as the 13 colonies in New England, right? And then gradually expanded westward. And there's also a phase of consolidation. It went through a civil war. And so there are a lot of parallels between the United States and China that we can sort of think about. But if you look at the process here, look at the time here, from 1616 to about 1683, they were about 67 years. That is that the whole process took very long time. From a very small political unit into the regional hegemon, it took about 67 years. So it's a very, very long process. And the domination phase, you have another maybe about 69 years, right? And there's also somewhat a long process. So first of all, on state building, and that's the first period. And Charles Tilly has a famous quote, war made a state and the state made war. And the process of Manchu state building fits this very nicely. Originally, there were several tribes spread around in Manchuria, and then a leader called Nurhaci decided to unify all the different tribes and build a state. And he has a lot of grievances against Ming China. He listed 7 big grievances. And so once all the tribes were conquered, and then he attacked Ming China and eventually conquered Liaodong. And so once the state was formed, at first he called it the later Qing dynasty, and then changed the name to the Qing dynasty later on. But he faced two strategic problems. First is that if he goes south to attack Ming China, he's going to fear being cut off by the Koreans and also by the Mongols. So he needed to deal with these two potential threats. So eventually he attacked these two actors and were able to force them into submission, and especially for Korea. Korea became a tributary state finally in 1636. So that's before the conquest of Ming China. Korea had become a tributary state of the Qing dynasty. So if you look at the map here, that is, it started from this place called Jianzhou, and then there were a few tribes spreading out here. And eventually those were all conquered. And then the new state attacked the Liaodong Peninsula here. But the key target is to come to Beijing, but it will face Korean intervention because at that time Korea was still a tributary state of Ming China. And the Ming China helped Korea fight off the Japanese, right, in 1592, the Hideyoshi's invasion. So they were very grateful to Ming China, and they really would not like to become a tributary state of the Manchus. But they were not able to do it because they were basically forced to submit. And then the Mongols here, same thing here, would attack them. So he had to deal with these two flanks in order to be able to go south. So that's the first stage in terms of the state building process. And the second stage was the conquest of China, and it wasn't a very quick process. It took about 18 years to complete. So the first thing is that the Manchu troops occupied Beijing, and the reason being that there were a lot of rebels in China. So China was in turmoil at that time. And so the emperor was killed by the rebels, Li Zhichen, and then someone, Wu Sangui, invited the Manchus to come in. And then so the Manchus basically came into Beijing unopposed. They opened the door, welcomed them, but they didn't know that they were going to conquer China at that time. But other parts of China, they put out a fierce resistance to the Manchus. And so the Manchus started to go through a long process of pacification, of resistance in a lot of towns, right? And those towns, they refused to submit. They were massacred. So there were lots of massacres in that process of conquest. But even more cities or towns, they opened their gates without any resistance because they knew that they were not able to fight. And so the period ended with the execution of the last Ming emperor. So the very last Ming emperor was fleeing, and the Manchus were chasing him, and eventually he went to Burma. And then the Qing troops led by Wu Sangui went to Burma and asked for the Ming emperor. And so he was captured and sent back to China and was executed. So that means that the last line of the Ming imperial family ended in that time. And so that completed the conquest of mainland China. But then it went through a third phase, a consolidation phase. And the first thing is that there's a huge civil war that broke out within the Qing dynasty, because they were the three feudatories. They were surrendered Ming generals, and because they helped the Manchus conquer China, so they were given a lot of lands in the south. So they were sort of like a local principalities within China, and they grew too powerful. So the central government in Beijing at that time would try to reduce or eliminate their power, and which caused a rebellion. And so the country was engulfed in a huge civil war, 8 years, much longer. And Emperor Kangxi at that time, he said to his children that this is the only period in his lifetime that he was depressed. That is, that he was really feared that the whole country would collapse because of the civil war. But eventually, Kangxi was able to prevail because he had more economic resources. The war turned into a war of attrition, and eventually, the one that had more money were able to prevail. And so, once they were suppressed, there's also another issue of Taiwan. That is that first the Dutch, and then the Zheng Chenggong, and then his descendants were there and put up a resistance. And for a while, Zheng Chenggong's fleet went to Beijing and put up a huge fight there. And so it was a threat to the Manchus. So they decided to to conquer Taiwan. And so they were able to do it in the year 1683. And then the courts went into the debate. Kangxi originally said Taiwan is just a tiny piece of land, like a bowl of mud. So we get nothing by acquiring it, and we lose nothing by giving it up. But eventually, the Emperor Shilang convinced him that Taiwan has strategic value, because if Taiwan were used by foreigners or by adversaries, it could resist, it could threaten China's security. So eventually, Taiwan was incorporated into the empire as part of the Fujian prefecture, Fujian province, but Taiwan was a prefecture at that time. And so once Taiwan was conquered, there was no resistance to Qing rule. So the Qing dynasty had become a regional hegemon in that area. And the final phase is this westward expansion. And this is where this part gets interesting. You have the Russians coming into the scene. And then there's a Zhongao Mongols in the west trying to build their own state. And so the Qing at that time, they faced this kind of two potential threats. They were aware of Russian activities in the north, but they were not able to deal with it because of domestic problems. They need to fight the rebellions and then conquer Taiwan, so they were not able to deal with the Russian threat. But after everything was consolidated, they were able to deal with this too. And so eventually they basically signed a peace with the Russians to gain Russian neutrality. And because the Qing dynasty feels that these two adversaries, the Russians and the Mongols, will make an alliance against the Qing dynasty. And that is their strategic nightmare. So they were trying to prevent that from happening. So they signed a peace treaty with the Russians. So this is how it looks like around that time. So the Russians, they were gradually moving east, so there were a lot of outposts here. Eventually, they went to Vladivostok in the Pacific. And the Mongols, they were trying to build a state in this area, right, the modern current Xinjiang area. And the Qing dynasty was there. So there were these three actors. So their fear is that the Mongols were trying to make contacts with the Russians, asking the Russians for assistance to attack the Qing dynasty. So that's the something that the Qing dynasty will try to prevent. And also, if there's a state, a Mongol state here, that means that all the Mongol tribes or the Mongols that have submitted to the Qing dynasty, they may want to join them, and they might resist Qing rule. And so that became a threat to the existence of the Qing dynasty. So they decided to, Emperor Kangxi tried to deal with it. And so what it did is to use a combination of diplomacy and war. So the first thing is here, the Qing used military force to attack Russian settlements in Siberia. And they destroyed one, Elbazin, in 1685, but the Russians rebuilt it a few years later. And so the Qing dynasty couldn't really deal with it. And then they came out with an idea that well, maybe we should try to cut a deal, a peace deal with the Russians. And then they would gain Russian neutrality, and we will be able to drive a wedge between these two potential adversaries. So there's a very first treaty that the polity in China signed with a Western power, the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. And it was actually an equal treaty. And the treaty, the authoritative version was Latin, not Chinese. And the treaty has 5 languages: Latin, Russian, Mongols, Manchus, and Chinese. But the Latin was the authoritative language because there were 2 Jesuits helping the negotiation at that time. But the key thing is to gain Russian neutrality. And so once Russian promised to remain neutral, Emperor Kangxi started personally led 4 attacks on the Zhongars. And the first 2 are much larger in scale. So I listed only 2 here. But the problem that he faced is really logistical problems. That is that he failed because of logistics. And if you look at the 4 campaigns, especially the first one simply went here. But then the Mongols fled because they heard the Qings were coming. And so they were very mobile. They are skilled in cavalry warfare. So the first one failed. And the second one was the major one. So there are 3 armies, east, central, and west. And the Western army was there to cut off the Mongols' fleeing route. But when Kangxi went to this area, he basically ran out of food. So he had to return. And so he was not able to really campaign that far away. And that historically has been a key problem for China, even for Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty, Emperor Yongle personally led 5 expeditions into the Mongol heartland, trying to defeat the Mongols, but he couldn't do it because of logistics. Because in ancient time, you had to walk. There's no train, no cars, and you had to walk. That takes a very, very long time. So you need to supply your troops, feed them, and that was a very, very major difficulties. There was not, the Ming Dynasty was not able to overcome. And so there was some engagement with the Mongols, with the West Army, but it was still, the Mongols still fled. So the Emperor Kangxi couldn't solve the problem. And so it's really the issue of logistics. And so for instance, the Qing troops had to march 2,000 kilometers and over 98 days, more than 3 months. And so that's very difficult for a mass army to campaign that far away. And his successor, Emperor Yongzheng, tried to solve the problem. He launched a major attack, but he lost 80% of his troops. So it's a very dangerous business to go out into the steppe and to attack the Mongols, because you need to have good logistics. So finally, Emperor Qianlong was able to solve the logistics problem, and that is that he built a very extensive logistical network to supply his troops. And we can do a comparison between the march of Qing troops and the march of Napoleon to Moscow. Right? So the Qing dynasty traveled over 3,000 kilometers and over 15 months. And Napoleon, about 2,400 kilometers and 9 months. Right? We know Napoleon failed, but the Qing dynasty was successful. And so eventually, the area that is known as Xinjiang became part of China. And then the Zunga state was basically eliminated by the Qing troops. And some historians have been using the word ethnic genocide to describe the brutality of the conflict. And so I have a quote from Peter Perdue talking about this. Although it's sort of a forgotten part of history, but gradually some scholars are beginning to take a look at the whole process. And so here's the map of Emperor Qianlong's campaigns. As you can see, it's very extensive, a lot of different supply routes. And basically the whole country was mobilized to supply the expeditions. And so eventually all this area were pacified and became part of the Qing dynasty. And so by this time, the Qing dynasty, when the Zunga state was destroyed, basically faced no more threat. And so the Russians were not able to threaten China for a very, very long time. So the whole war, the war has a very significant point, and that is that throughout Chinese history, the major threat, security threat, came from the nomads. And so historically, the Chinese repeatedly faced different nomadic confederations. But until the Qing dynasty, it was solved. And so all the problems, the nomadic confederations were eliminated. Because the Qing dynasty has the 8-banner system. They put the conquered Mongols into different banners to break up their original tribal structures. So later they became what is known as Qiren, sort of a part of the Manchu people, and they lost their identity. So eventually the nomadic confederation, excuse me, were finally eliminated. And also it sent a strong signal to the Russians that the Qing dynasty should not be challenged. And the Russians did not challenge China for almost 100 years until the late 1800s. By that time, if you look at all the indicators of power, the Qing dynasty will have become the most powerful state in the world, basically, at any time. So in 1793, that's when Lord Macartney's mission to China from the UK, from Britain, right? And when he came to China, China was at the apex of its power at that time. So that's the first part about the pursuit of power. And second, about governance of the system. That is, there's a tribute system, although it wasn't established originally by the Manchus, because China has been using it. But the Qing dynasty inherited the tribute system and adapted it. And so it came out with a new institution called the Fan Yuan, or the Court of Colonial Affairs, to to administer Mongols and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But on the other hand, there's tribute, the traditional tribute system. And so you can think of Qing China as a system manager. That is, well, it's the most powerful state in the system, and it was able to manage how states interact with each other. And you need to become part of the tribute system in order to trade and also to conduct diplomacy with China at that time. And so it has its foundation in material power, because it was the most powerful state at that time. You were able to force Korea into submission and also to draw other countries into part of the tribute system. And so for lesser states, it's a bargain because they gain security protection. Because you're part of the tribute system, you gain security, and you're also allowed to trade. And in ancient time, that's a good bargain because there's no concept of sovereignty at that time, right? And so for them, it's a very simple bargain. And then there's also the Confucianism at play as well, because according to Confucianism, hierarchy was both stabilizing and also natural. And because within the family, it's a hierarchical. You have the parents and the children. And within the state, the same thing, you have the emperor and then ministers. So everything is hierarchical. And once you have that, you have stability. And so the idea can be projected into foreign relations in the form of the tribute system. And so here's a list of Qing tributary states. There's not many here, only about 7. And the reason being that a lot were conquered, right? The Mongols, the Uyghurs, they became dependencies. And so you have a list of states here, but they gradually became part of the tribute system. And the Sulu is in the Philippines, somewhere there. And other countries are still in place today. And so once they become a part of the system, that is, that there were no resistance to their dominance, and they basically everybody has its role, has their roles within the tributary system. So that's about the case of the Qing dynasty, and so I'd like to save a few minutes for how do we look at China's present rise based on what we have known, and also based on the theory, a realist theory here. So first thing, if you look at China today, it's the century of humiliation, right? And so since the Opium War until World War II, the country was invaded and attacked several times and had to sign unequal treaties. So it's the kind of century of humiliation. So today's China is talking about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, right? And Xi Jinping is talking about the China dream. And so a lot of things is about how do we become strong and powerful again, and that's the only way we can defend ourselves. So starting from Sun Yat-sen to Chiang Kai-shek and to Mao Zedong, same thing here. They all want to build a strong nation. And so the pursuit of power is still there. But in terms of foreign policy, we see kind of a different variations in terms of the PRC. But more recently, you see that there's a correlation between the rise in relative power and also the degree of assertiveness in its own foreign policy. So first thing is about the idea of peer competitor and also a few raw indicators of power between the United States and China. So in the year 2004, the US economy ranked #1, and China ranked #7. So in terms of the size of GDP, China was still relatively small compared to the US. And military expenditure, the same thing. US was $455 billion, and China was 35. And this is official figure, so the actual figure may be different. But still, in terms of ranking, China was #5. And so this was also the period where China was keeping a low profile. They talk about Tao Guang Yang Hui, right? Keeping a low profile and hide in the shadow. Do not try to be too provocative. And there's a good strategic reason for that to happen, right? Because in terms of power indicators, they were still not in a good position to come out yet. And last year, the gap has substantially shortened. First thing, China became the #2 economy in the world. So in terms of GDP there's roughly about 1 to 2 ratios, and China is catching up. And also in terms of military expenditures, it's the same thing here. China is catching up, but the U.S. still, the lead is still very far, right? 1 to 7 ratio. And so we had to put these things in perspective. That is, although China is rising today, but it has not really risen to the top yet. There's still a gap between China and the United States. Although in terms of GDP, we know one day if the economy continue to grow, China will surpass the United States. But at present, it's not there yet. And if you look at the military expenditures of the United States, and you can see how big of a slice that the United States has in this pie here, right? It's not half of the world's total military expenditures, but in 2011, about 41%. And it's more than the next 10 countries combined. So if you combine the military expenditures of these countries, they are not as much as America's military expenditures. So in terms of military power, the U.S. is far ahead in terms of the rest. Although GDP, China is catching up, but in terms of military power, there's still a large gap. But people have started to notice a few recent developments. That is, well before 2008, the idea was first peaceful rise and then peaceful development, right? So China should try to create a peaceful international environment so that it could concentrate on economic development. So that kind of logic was put in place before 2008, and it's the Taoguang-Yang-Hui strategy. But after the global financial crisis, people started to notice increasing level of assertiveness, right? First in East China Sea with Japan, and then in the South China Sea as well. So China has increased its maritime patrols in these two areas, and also, especially with Japan, there were a lot of close calls between the Chinese Coast Guards and the Japanese Coast Guards near the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands. And so the balance of power is shifting in China's favor, although China was not does not have a preponderance of power there yet. But at least there seems to be some correlation between its rising power and its foreign policy posture. And more recently, I think the Chinese leadership realized this. So there were sort of talks about meetings that they were trying to adjust their foreign policy. So we may see that kind of adjustment, but that still makes good strategic sense because now it's not really not a time to come out and become overtly assertive because the China's material power isn't at that level yet. And so there's a structural contradiction between the two, and that is that, well, the United States the policy of the U.S. is to prevent the rise of a regional hegemony in Asia and also in Europe. So that is why the United States intervened in Europe during World War I and World War II to prevent the rise of a regional hegemony there. And the same strategy was in Asia as well. Remember that the White House wanted to maintain a balance of power in Asia, right, that favors freedom. What do you mean by balance of power? That means that nobody could dominate. And so it's packaged in a very nice diplomatic language, but in essence, it's really there's a structural contradiction within that America's objective of preventing the regional hegemony and China's rise. Eventually, China's rise will challenge that policy objective. And so I have a few quotes here basically from different thinkers, and they're all saying the same thing. Right? Joseph Nye said, deterring the rise of hegemonic forces. And even Henry Kissinger said this, it is in the American interest to resist the effort of any power to dominate Asia. Right? And then the QDR from the Pentagon say basically the same thing. And you can find lots of quotes from American scholars, leadership about this kind of plan, this kind of objective. And the Chinese, they came up with this word structural contradiction, right? There's 结构的矛盾. There's this problem that exists between the United States and China. And so there's a security dilemma operating between the United States and China. That is China's military modernization. For the Chinese, they said this is purely defensive. But for the United States, they were not so sure. And also for neighboring Asian countries, right? They were not so sure that there was purely defensive. And the same thing for for the Chinese side, American troops in Asia, right, the Chinese were asking, why are you there? Why are you here, right, at our doorstep? And the United States said, well, we're here to maintain peace and stability. But the Chinese was not so sure about that, right? They said, well, what if you use it against us? So there's a kind of a security dilemma operating between the two. And so there's a report out by Brookings last year by Ken Lieberthal. I think he was here before, and Wang at Beida, in talking about the corrosive distrust between the two countries. Right? It's basically the result of a security dilemma between the two. And so we can anticipate that as China continue to rise, the kind of security competition will intensify down the road. So to conclude my talk here is that I make the argument that and basically this is not simply a replay of history. It's an argument based in theory, in realist theory of international relations, and that says that rising states will expand political interests abroad. And actually, China today has more political interests abroad. In Africa, the Chinese are almost in a lot of places in Africa, in Latin America as well. And that interest we can expect that to continue to rise. And then about the rules of the game, right? China has been talking about how to change or shape or not necessarily overturn, but how to make the rules of the game that works to China's favor. And so they were trying to do that as well. And finally, about a relative power, that is that, well, at present, China is not, there's still a gap between China and the United States. And the question is that what would happen when the gap disappears? And that's still down in the future. But the best guy is still to look at China's relative power. Okay, thank you, I'll stop here.